I will move immediately to our first keynote speaker, to our first plenary by Robert Cowen. Robert Cowen is an emeritus professor of education at the University College London, at the Institute of Education of the UCL in the UK. He is currently a member of the editorial board of the journal Comparative Education, and of course, as he would like me to stress, an honorary member of the Comparative Education Society in Europe.
That means I don't have to pay fees, which is good.
His main current interest is, of course, the theoretical foundations of comparative education, and of course, his future. But I would say, Bob, that paradoxically, you have been writing a lot about the history of comparative education, although you stress your anxiety is the future of the field. I leave that to you and explain that to the colleagues and students. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lefteris. Thank you, everybody, especially Lila, for looking after me so well before this morning began. And I should thank my wife, whose section of our shared computer I am allowed to use for this lecture. I'm very worried about the pedagogy in Zoom. And my suggestion to you is that you lengthen the lunch hour and you let the students have a bit more wine. And that will probably improve the pedagogy of the afternoon. But let me be very cautious, because the students are not directly my responsibility. What I want really from the students is not that they read my suggested readings. If you haven't read them, so what? Read them later. I want you, though, to discuss the ideas I'm offering this morning with your friends, and preferably, I want you not to be able to go to sleep tonight because you're thinking about these ideas. And then suddenly learning.
Remember to share your screen with us.
Oh, that's a very dangerous idea.
How to do that?
How do I do that?
Like you did before.
Well, I did it before, but I had about 8 teachers.
Laya's here to tell you. Share screen. You press the share screen button.
And that is share screen. I see. All right. How's that? I pressed the share screen button.
Nothing yet?
Then you need to choose the slides, what you want to share with us.
I wanted basically just to share the PowerPoint with you. That's all.
Yeah, right. We can say it now, Bob.
Well done, Robert.
Great, thanks.
Well, that's good. Like a trained monkey, I can now press the correct buttons. That's great. Yeah, good. All right, so I'll continue. Fully trained for the pedagogic purposes of working in a COVID era via these idiotic teaching devices called Zoomies. What I'm going to do then is try to talk you through the 3 main words in the title of my talk. So the crucial words: comparisons, traveling, and community. These words interest me a great deal, but I don't want the students, I don't want you to write down what I'm saying and try to remember it. You've got to work out your own answers. It's a new generation now. You guys will be in charge of this field of study in a decade. I mean, it's time to work out your own answers and not just borrow mine. The problem is this, that everybody knows that professors know things. I mean, the devil knows this, of course, and that's not true. Only presidents like Mr. Trump, prime ministers such as Mr. Boris Johnson, prophets and so I won't mention any names in case I get into a lot of trouble. And populists, no, they're the only people who know. Academics and professors try to know. We suggest ideas, and we offer theories. We try to know, but we're often wrong. So all I'm going to do today is try to offer a way to see the world, a way to think. I don't ask you to accept it. I do ask you to discuss it, disagree with it, shout at each other rather than me, and have some extra wine at lunch. If you get lost, it's simple. Go back to the course outline, the one of the globe ed winter thing. The questions there in sections A1 and A2 are superb. So if you get lost, simply go back to that. That was interesting. I'm starting. The first concept I want to take up is the concept of comparison. And I want to start with the notion that there are a lot of very silly ideas about what comparison is and what is comparative education. In the journal, we get a lot of articles which really are saying, I did some research in Iran or Italy or Indonesia, and I was therefore doing comparative education. So we get these silly articles where someone interviewed 6 people in Italy and they're offering that as comparative education. That's not comparative education, nor is it comparison. Other rather angry people who lie a lot suggest that comparative education has to compare 2 countries. It has to. In other words, you compare this with that. So comparison is defined by juxtaposition, which is childlike. I mean, children in Japan spend 6 hours doing homework every night when they're aged 8. Children in England spend 3 hours doing homework every night when they're aged 8. I mean, that's comparison, yes, but it's not comparative education. It's just information for civil servants or worried ministers of education. And there are some rather silly people who have argued for a long time that comparative education can only be done through special methods. This was the position of some of the classic scholars, Brian Holmes, Edmund King. This is untrue. Comparative education is not defined by its method. There are more dangerous and more contemporary ideas. One of the histories of comparative education is that it's improved over the years, over 200 years, to become a science. But nobody ever defines a science. Does a science discover causes? Or does a science predict correctly? So Einstein's theory, for example, does not identify causes, but it has successfully predicted a remarkable number of things in the last decades. So one definition of science is that science works, things are scientific when you can do correct predictions. And this vocabulary in the literature that comparative education is now a science is a very dangerous vocabulary because people are not defining the concept of science they have in mind. There is another wonderful idea that PISA is comparative. No, it's not. It simply puts some results of tests from various countries side by side. It explains nothing. It understands nothing. It says nothing about the nature of societies. It is simply a measuring instrument, like a thermometer. You can tell whether it's hot or whether it's cold. PISA is not comparative education because it pays no attention to the historical, sociological, economic forces which shape education. And the last example I give here is that everyone's a comparativist now because the world is globalized and we all travel a lot. That's such a silly idea, I'm not even going to discuss it. There's a more dangerous idea that comparative education is useful because it can advise ministers. Really? Which ministers would you like to advise? Stalin's ministers of education? Would you perhaps like to have advised Nazi ministers of education? Would you like to have advised the South African Minister of Education in the time of apartheid? Comparative education is a university subject. Can it have its justification that its job is to advise ministers? That is what civil servants are for. And university academics are not civil servants, except in a trivial technical sense in some countries. There's another rather dangerous narrowing of the concept of comparative, that comparative education is useful because it can improve educational policy. This is a lovely assumption when your society is democratic, when society is at peace, when the society has no angry racists in it. And so we'll gradually fine-tune educational policy. But no, I suggest to you that the purpose of studying comparisons and comparative education in university cannot be to advise on the improvement of educational policy. How about critiquing educational policy? How about disagreeing with the minister on educational policy? The only one of these cliches that I have much sympathy with is the idea that comparative education can be useful in the initial training of teachers because it can disturb their parochialism. It can convince German students, for example, that German professors are not automatically the best in the world. It can convince American students that American society is surprisingly racist. It can convince English students that the Scottish have a better education system. So it can disturb prejudices. And this I like as a pedagogic mode. Now, I said those ideas about comparison were silly. I want to suggest that there are even sillier ideas than that. One of the silly ideas is from Sir Michael Sadler, who wrote a paper in 1900, and his question is an extremely dangerous one. How far can we learn anything of practical value from the study of foreign education systems? What? This means that comparison is a form of plumbing. I mean, I can improve the plumbing by looking at plumbing in Germany. Well, I probably can, but surely comparative education and comparisons cannot be reduced to practical value, sort of automobile mechanics for educational systems. And similarly, the notion that comparative education is about educational policy, that it's a policy science, and that's why it's studied in universities, is a very unfortunate narrowing of the intellectual responsibilities of comparative education. So I disagree with all of these cliches. And there are some very contemporary ones which I disagree with also. Andreas Casamias, for example, has argued furiously for years that comparative education has to be based on history. Really? I mean, I have proof that comparison should have a strong historical motif, that we should be able to think historically. But why history? And why should comparative education be based on political science, which is what George Bernaday thought? Or why should comparative education be given to the sociologists? They're often very parochial in their thinking and in their research. Although comparative education is a matter of statistics. These are all dangerous narrowings of the concept of comparative. And there's a very dangerous broadening. Comparative education is interdisciplinary. And I hear a lot of young people using this word interdisciplinary, but they don't define it. They have no theoretician of interdisciplinarity. So this long word, interdisciplinary, I suggest to you, means nothing except at several intellectual perspectives, sociological, historical, economic, and so on, are used within comparisons or within comparative education. So I reject all these cliches about what is comparison and how to do it. But there's an even more interesting flaw at the heart of this question. What is comparative education? The assumption that it is, that there's a thing which it's a quintessence, it's always there. No, comparative education changes over time. The ways that people think about comparisons of education change very rapidly after the Second World War, but have been changing for 200 years. Notice, please, that there are also different forms of comparison, comparative education. There's the business of teaching young people to become students, teaching young people to become teachers, and you use comparative education within that to broaden their perspectives. There's comparative education as funded research, where you work for the Ford Foundation and you do the research they want. Or there's comparative education as consultancy. You go to Belarus and you advise the Ministry of Education on what would be a good warlike curriculum. Consultancy work in comparative education. There's also the comparative education of the international agencies, the World Bank, for example. UNESCO offers a comparative perspective. And there is comparative education as organized academic university subject. So can we be very cautious about the notion that there is a special thing called comparative education, or a special thing called comparisons of educational systems, which has these fixed purposes like advising on policy. It has a fixed aspiration to become a science. These are old cliches about the field, and it's time that they all get rethought. So that was my first theme. In contrast, I want to, and that was my first theme, and the perils. In contrast, I want to stress some possibilities for comparative education right now. I want to argue that comparative education is where international power interacts with domestic power to shape the education of the child or the young or the student. And at this intersection of international power, think of international socialism, for example, or think of flows of power from the Catholic Church, or think of PISA, flows of international power, where they intersect with domestic obstacles, domestic power. This is where comparative education exists. And I suggest to you that it is morally rooted in this problem, and it is morally rooted in our refusal to accept that certain ways of treating young people, such as no education for girls, no education for women, are not acceptable. So comparative education, I suggest to you, has a moral base in that we judge the concept of education which is on offer in apartheid South Africa, in Stalin's Russia, in Taliban Afghanistan. And I want to suggest to you that its core intellectual concern is with transfer. What I'll get onto later is the 3T problem. So I want to argue that intellectually, comparative education is rooted in the concern with transfer and its various forms, whether that is in the forms of empire, the Spanish in Argentina, the Portuguese initially in Brazil, the British in India, or whether it's in the transfer of educational institutions from one place to another. For example, the Humboldt University moved from Germany to the United States. it didn't do so because the American government asked for it. It didn't do so because the German government exported it, but it was moved. And that is a transfer. And the question is, as it moves, how does it change? So the intellectual question is very interesting. As it moves, how does it morph? And there's a very fine example, which I'll mention again later, in Mao's China and the import of Soviet models of good education. So my own view is that comparative education is concerned to understand imperium. And by the word imperium, I mean forms of domination. They include political, they include economic, they include religious, but they include the compression of those forms of power into educational patterns. And so I'm suggesting that comparative education reveals imperium, flows of international power, forms of domination, and thus it criticizes, for example, PISA, because PISA carries a clear ideology about economic modernization of a certain kind. Comparative education is not an easy thing to be thinking about, because there are huge confusions about what is international and what is comparative. It's also a very difficult area because ideally you need to know something of history, you need to speak several languages, you should ideally be well informed about political science or political theory, economic theory, and so on. So it's an incredibly difficult area of work, but it's one which I personally find completely fascinating. Okay, now I've got on the second theme an important caveat. In the title that I have, there is the word traveling. Now, I have severe reservations about the word traveling. I link traveling with some of the thinking of Tom Popkowitz, who I personally find a delightful human being and brilliantly original. But traveling is too vague for me. It's a bit like the word comparisons. It's too vague for me. Traveling, I want to know about the politics of travel. Why does something travel? What's pushing it? What's attracting it? What are the intellectual and imperial forces at work to create the traveling? So I don't want to use the word traveling, nor do I want to use the concept educational system. It's not my job to do plumbing. It's not my job to improve educational systems. I want to worry about the concept of educated identity, which is being moved around. So when we look at PISA, I'm not interested in PISA as a measuring device. I'm interested in PISA's embracement of a certain kind of educated identity. That is why I want the politics of the word transfer as the center of comparisons, rather than what is for me the looser word traveling. Okay. Notice also there is another word which is very important, and it's in the title, and it's the word translation. And this is a cute word. It's very nice. Translation of policy sounds good. No, it's too simple. The concept is not translation. The concept is a 3T concept. It's transfer and translation and transformation. It's the 3T problem of the thing moving. What are the political forces of that? The thing being adapted in a new place. What are the political forces of that? And the thing changing in its new place. What are the political forces of that? So I'm saying it's a 3T problem and not a 1T problem. It's not a translation problem. It's a 3T problem. And I chose to offer a very fast and simple example of the occupation of Japan in 1945 by the Americans. What did the Americans do? They abolished a thing called Shushin, which they thought had contributed to militarism. They insisted the Japanese create a co-education system. They incredibly increased the size of the higher education system, teacher education institutions plus universities. They removed the term imperial university because they didn't like that. And they created the 6-3-3 system of schooling, 6 years elementary, 3 years junior high, 3 years senior high. So that was the transfer. Now, as that transfer took place, who did the translation? MacArthur. MacArthur and the American occupation authorities did the translation. They decided not simply what should be transferred, but what its significance and meanings were. So they transferred these things in the name of democratization of Japan, and the Americans had control over the translation. There was no particular debate with the Japanese about what would be imported, what would be transferred. And that's different from the German situation, where the Germans, in quotes, West Germany, argued furiously with the Americans about what was good secondary education and what was good university education. The Germans did not want American-style university. They wanted their own. And there was a rather powerful refusal of American translation with a beautiful expression, the Germans saying, among other things, Americans, they live in skyscrapers and drink gin and listen to jazz. And that was part of the cultural resistance to American transfer and translation. In contrast, in quotes, East Germany, there was an acceptance of the transfer, not least because of the German Communist Party and the Soviet occupation. And normally in imperial situations, France, Britain, Spain, it's the imperial power which translates. So transfer translation make very clear the patterns of power. Let me give you one more example. State socialist systems. Again, not merely what is transferred. What was being transferred was a Soviet system from the USSR to China after 1945. But who translates? In the first instance, 1945 through about 1949, to about 1964, the people who translated were the Soviets, USSR, almost literally. And the Soviet textbooks were translated word for word for China. So very much control over transfer, very much control over translation. But in a cultural revolution, there was massive resistance by Mao to this translation of the socialist education system. And you got a rejection of the Soviet model in the Cultural Revolution. If you want to read an interesting book, as a kind of almost a novel, it's a story of somebody's life, Zhong Chang, and her remarkable book, The White Swans. I was in China in 1973, and it was still in its very interesting Mao period. And it was a very interesting cultural shock for me to see the form of transformation as the Soviet system became Chinese, but became Maoist Chinese. So the processes are three: the transfer, translation, and transformation, not just translation. There's a lot of literature on this stuff. And let me leave you with a sort of open question. Who translated socialist education as that moved into Cuba? I mean, struggle with that one. There are other examples. For David Phillips has written brilliantly, for example, on the struggle over translation in the British zone in West Germany. And given the hysteria about about Pisa in Spain, who translates Pisa in your country? We had a so-called Minister of Education as a Secretary of State for it, called Michael Gove. And he translated Pisa for England. Unfortunately, he didn't translate it for Scotland, which has an independent education system. I was very disappointed, by the way, that apparently no Scottish students in the group. I spent all last week learning Lowland Scots. I memorized Spanish the week before that. I remembered my schoolboy German the week before this, and I was thinking I would startle everybody by speaking Lowland Scots, but I can't. I therefore decided I would speak English this morning, which is very boring. Okay. There's a final thing, which is the transformation. And that's where the system that's been imported becomes localized again. An example would be Japan. The prestigious universities in Japan are the old ones, the former imperial universities. Over a period of 30 years, the American system became Japanified. It became localized. It became transformed, absorbed domestically. And similarly, the so-called democratic system of 6 years of elementary schooling, then you go to junior high, then you go to senior high, 633. No, the Japanese put examinations after the junior high. It's a 6-3 examination system and a 633 examination system before you go to university. It became Japanese again. All right, let me skip that one. I was grumbling I had to learn bloody Latin because of all these Romans that invaded England 2,000 odd years ago. And I had to do exams in Latin when I was a kid. Moving on. The crucial meaning I want to offer is that the transformation theme is where the concept of education identity becomes localized, domesticated. So it's a crucial theme right now. What is the nature of post-socialist education as it goes through transformation phase? Given the French, American in the Philippines, for example, and British empires, what is the nature of the transformation of post-colonial educated identities, which is going on in those empires? All right. A quick point in case clever people like lecturers think I've forgotten it. It's actually a 4T problem, because there is another concept which fascinates me, transitologies, when societies change at incredible speed. I haven't forgotten that. I just didn't want to distract myself with it this morning. I've got a last thematic. How am I doing for time, Leftrish?
You have time, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, I apologize.
No, we have time. We have time.
Okay. I apologize for speaking English so quickly, but I was a bit worried about the timing and I wanted to get back on track so I don't stop much later than 12:15 or thereabouts. I've lectured for 45 minutes or something. I want to pick up one of the other big words in the title. There's comparisons and traveling and community. Community is a lovely word. I like community. Think of the Welsh mining villages. Think of Danish concept of hua. Think of a democratic concept of community in Scotland, which is much more inclusive than English notions of a society. And think of Brazil, where I happen to be at the moment, a community of football, of carnival, which has been cancelled in a lot of places this year. And of course, the samba. That's lovely. Yeah. But what about slavery in Brazil? That wasn't abolished until the very late 19th century. So community is a lovely word, and it makes you feel good. Especially it makes you feel good if you worry about Davos and neoliberalism and empires. But why is it in the title of your course? I'm very keen on community. I grew up in a mining community. When I was a kid, I was surrounded by miners who were very brave people physically. And women were expected to be very strong emotionally because of disasters in the pit. And the kids were part of that community, and they were taught not to cry, because that's important in a mining community. And so if I fell off my bike or something and I bled all over the place, that was all right, but I wasn't allowed to cry. So I felt very much part of a community with a very clear identity. So I wondered why the word community was in the title of the course. It's because of UNESCO concepts of global citizenship? No, I don't think so. I want to stress also the perils of this word community. Remember that in Britain, in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, there was a referendum on leaving the EU, and the English voted to leave, very much based on the problem of migration, immigration, very much based on xenophobia. And at the moment, there is unease about Venezuelan refugees in Brazil. So there are always moments of tension around this concept of community. The Québécois, for example, the meeting, in a sense, is taking place in Barcelona. So Catalans, and of course, Scotland is thinking about, or at least the leader in Scottish politics at the moment, is thinking about Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. And notice that in Northern Ireland and in Ireland, Sinn Féin, one of the political parties, has raised again the question of making Ireland a community. Okay, so there are always tensions around community. There are also moments of tragedy. If you think about the American Civil War, it was a tragic civil war in terms of concepts of community. The killings in Northern Ireland, which involved shooting of civilians in the end by the British Army. Think of apartheid in South Africa with the Boer community feeling threatened. Think of Miles Davis or Louis Armstrong not being able to stay in certain hotels in the Deep South, even in the 1950s. Think of the horrendous massacres of Hindus and Muslims in British India as British India came apart. So I was wondering, where does this word community in the title come from? Also remember that there are communities of hate. Obviously, the killing of Jews in the Second World War across Europe, but it's much older than that. It goes back to the things like the burning of heretics. And in London, remember the race riots in 1956. Notting Hill is a movie, Julia Roberts and so on, but Notting Hill in my childhood was a place of race riots. Not in my childhood, I was a university student and I lived in Notting Hill at the time of the race riots. So bending the knee is not just an oddity by football players. It's still deadly serious. And remember communities of hate and the riots in Charlottesville and Mr. Trump only a few days ago. So how does the word community how does it become so visible in the title of the course? Now, I think, having read and reread the rubric, the A1 and A2 sections, that in the vocabulary used in the course, it simply means what I'm calling the domestic. In other words, international ideas flow, and then domestic forces sometimes block them, sometimes accept them. political forces, economic forces, religious forces. These domestic forces sometimes accept, welcome, sometimes block. And if you look at the rubric that I read several times, I think the concept, the word community, is being used to mean domestic forces, domestic blockages. It is not, I think, being inserted in the course in a very precise way, building around concepts of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, or building around concepts of community in the thinking of Robert Nisbet. So I think what the reason it's got so much visibility is, I think it's an equivalent for my term, domestic blockages or domestic politics. It is not, I think, intended to mean global citizenship. And I don't think it is a precise enough word to be used analytically. I think it is a dangerous word because of communities of hate and so on. Furthermore, I think it is too important a word to be frittered away. In every country, you have the question of the education of minorities. In several countries, including, for example, England, there is a community, but there's a community of class. So you have Boris Johnson, you have Mr. Blair, you have Mr. Cameron, all going to private schools. There is a community of class. So I think community is too powerful a word, too complex a word to be used casually simply to mean domestic forces. I would rescue community, and I would thus rescue questions of feminism. I would rescue questions of race. I would rescue what we normally used to call intercultural questions, and I would pull them back fully into our comparative thinking. All right, conclusions. The crucial point is I don't have any. You guys are the people who are going to, I'm sorry, my wife gets very angry when I use that expression. You people, you wonderful persons, you brilliant students and academics, you are going to do the conclusions. You're going to get your conclusions. My conclusions are of no particular interest to anyone except me. I think what's happening at the moment is that we have a bit of a crisis. The huge thing which is going on is changes in forms of governance. And the nation state is now in a different poker game with, quotes, international forces. And so the concept of governance and who governs education systems has received massive research from people like Martin Lawn and Bob Lingard and the guys in Barcelona and so on. So this has been very, very important strategy of research. And it's been very timely in terms of the huge emphasis on neoliberal ideas and a notion that educational measurement and testing will give you progress. But I want to conclude in a slightly different way. I want to suggest that every generation of people doing comparisons reads the global. And I want to suggest that in the interwar period, the concern of comparisons was with fascism and communism in contrast to democracy. I also want to suggest that comparisons, comparative education, had changed after 1945 because it began to assess things like what held societies together, how divisive were different languages, how divisive were different races, how divisive were different religions, how divisive were political belief systems. That was the work of Nicholas Hans. And now, how do we label our world? Globalization, it's a very vague word. And notice that comparative education has used that word for a decade. before finally, thank goodness, it began to disappear. My own reading of the global is my comparative motif number 2. I simply repeat in that slide what I judge to be my crucial points when thinking about comparisons. I am emphasizing international political relations as central to comparisons in education, and that when they meet domestic forces, what I think in your course is called communities, when they meet domestic forces, that's when transfer, translation, and transformation gets to be very interesting. And I refuse the concept traveling, and I refuse the concept or an emphasis on educational policies. I refuse the notion of comparisons should assist governments, and I refuse the concept of educational systems. I want to rather stress the concept of educated identity, which is vital, e.g. in apartheid South Africa or in Taliban Afghanistan. And so I therefore spent a lot of time going on about the 3T problem and Imperium. And my last 2 slides are simply to push back to you the question, what's your global? The course is called GlobEd in the wintertime, although you apparently can't go skiing in Cyprus or something. So what's global? What's it mean? How do you slice it up on the course? Is there a global north and a global south? I mean, following the thinking of Connell in Australia, Ray Connell, there's a global south and a global north, and that's the problematic. So the world is split into 2 again, capitalist, communist, global north, global south. Or is there a contradiction between the global and community? The world is binary again. Somehow it's global, but also community. So is the global in the course, in your course, entirely about governance and education and identity, or is it just about governance? What is the concept of global in GlobEd? Is a question I'm putting to the students so that they can worry about this concept of glob. All right. I want to know, why is the world called global? Why is it not called transnational? Why is it not called international? Why are you not doing world studies? Now, the reason I pick out those words, transnational, international, world, is because there is a debate in the history of education at the moment about the importance of transnational history. There's a question about the importance of international history. There's a question about the importance of world history. We're not discussing that. We're going quickly to simple vocabularies like developing countries, undeveloped countries, and so on. We're not being cautious enough with our vocabularies. So communities, traveling, global, translation, these are all difficult, dangerous words. So my last point is to remind you that there is a wonderful new book out, the 2022 World Yearbook of Education. It's edited by Daniel Tröller of the University of Vienna and Nelly Piatova and Bill Parr in Canada. I'm sorry, I'm not sure about the third name. Nelly for sure, and Daniel for sure. Now that has got at least 15 chapters on the nation and education. The theory of the book is that there is a thing called banal nationalism, and that educational systems, among other things, transmit banal nationalism. So my final point is to draw to your attention this remarkable book, which helps you to make a distinction between local blockages done by the nation state, or local blockages done by banal nationalism, or local blockages done by banal religion, or local blockages done by banal concepts of gender, and so on. So I think there is a very, very important set of readings there for you. They're brand new, they're just out last month, and I recommend the first 15 or so chapters in the book. I do not recommend the 16th chapter because I wrote it. Thank you, Lefteris, I'm done.
Thank you, Bob. Well, traveling, translation, global, comparisons, community. You challenge all the notions in the winter school.
I don't want the students to sleep tonight, that's all. I mean, I want them worried, upset, anxious, arguing furiously. I want them cross and drinking wine. And then we might have got something approaching education going on here. So the best way to do that is to disagree with everybody I can think of.
But that was my second point. But at the same time, implicitly inviting all of us to think and rethink hard all those concepts that we chose to frame the topic of this winter school. We have Javier. We have half an hour. Yes, am I right?
Well, we have to fit the discussion about Bob's presentation and then space for the students to. Actually, what we do after that is students that have prepared the readings, they link it to the discussion. So maybe one way to proceed, but that depends on you, Lefteris and Bob. How do you feel with that? Is that students first intervene with their reflections about the readings and link it to the lecture, and then we have an overall discussion, and we can usually like half an hour or so altogether.
Okay.
This is absolutely okay with me. With you, Bob? Are you okay?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So we give the floor to the students now.
And then I can have breakfast after that. Can I, Lefteris?
Yes, absolutely.
You can do it in the meanwhile, Bob, if you want.
Yeah. You need to behave and be a good boy.
Yeah. I mustn't use you guys, yeah.
The students, are you ready?
I put them all to sleep, Lefteris. Oui.
That's okay. That's okay like this now.
Yeah, let's keep it this way, Bob. I mean,
well, Laia, do you have the names that are presenting today of the students? We have them in the program.
Yeah.
Oh, there's something with the sound. I will read the names. It's Nimra, Farista, Asif, Carlos, Junju, and Omaima.
Can you hear us? No.
Yes.
No. See?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So who wants to start?
This is the bit where you torture the students by forcing them to ask a question.
Absolutely.
Very into pedagogic mode, this one.
Yeah.
All right, let's torture them.
Active pedagogy. Yeah.
Yeah.
So who starts, Guy?
I can start. Carlos Bueno.
Thanks.
I suppose I have to say bueno to that, Carlos, do I?
Now you can practice your Spanish if you want. Yes, so I think that from the readings and from the discussion, I think that it is pretty clear that comparative education is a socially constructed field, that it has epistemological and cognitive reasons, but also sociological, and that there are macro and micro political interest and power relations which have led to the creation of comparative education as a field itself. From the readings, I think that the field is really strong institutionally. There are a lot of professional bodies, regional associations, international organizations, but it is less strong intellectually. And that one of the critiques I think that you mentioned is that this has led a lot to the instrumentalization of the field, and that I think I have experienced it personally, for example, in UNESCO, and you mentioned it a lot of times, how just putting two countries together, they mention it as comparative education, but epistemologically speaking, it's really weak to talk about that, no? I think that also this has led to a binary between what you call the academic comparative education and more the applied interventionist comparative education, in which the latter, many international organizations, is what they do, no? And I also think that one of the readings of Iveta Silova clearly explains how the field reproduces all these aspects. She talked a lot about that we students have to choose a specific position in terms of epistemology, that we have to choose whether we are more postmodernist or we are more positivist, things related with that. So I think that my question is, what's the level of agency that we have in the field? What are some of the kind of micro political decisions that we can take to move forward the field? And how in different positions that we are, either, for example, as consultants or academics, etc., what are some of the micro decisions that we can do to kind of move the field forward a bit?
Bueno. Now I've used all my Spanish. That was a brilliant framing of your question. Thank you very much. The first thing I would notice is that we are in a moment of generational change inside academic comparative education. You have older and extremely distinguished scholars, such as Gita Steiner-Kamsey in New York, such as Jürgen Schriever, until recently professor in Berlin. You have very good people within the Scottish tradition of comparative education. And of course, you have, as you pointed out, societies of comparative education in places like Argentina and Brazil, and I addressed a conference in Uruguay the other month, etc. So we're in a process where people such as Lefteris Cleriges are starting to write things which make the older scholars very angry, or at least upset, or with luck makes them cry, which is good. So you're getting people like Lefteris Cleriges, and among other people, Jason Beach, who is going to talk to you soon, tomorrow maybe, I don't remember. And these people are in the middle of rewriting comparative education. What happens to you in terms of micro-agency? Well, it's impossible to predict, but of course you have to make a choice, if you can have a choice, between working for one of the big and honorable agencies such as UNESCO, or doing a desperate and dangerous thing, which is trying to get an academic job under whatever title, sociologist, or doesn't matter, I mean, anthropologist or something. So you can rewrite comparative education and rethink the theory of comparisons, because that at the moment is where we're being saved by the young people rather than by the old. It's time to push aside people like myself and Schriever. We're too fixed in our positions. I was not, for example, impressed by the 2012 excuse me, I was not impressed by the 2012 World Yearbook of Education because it had adopted a position which goes back essentially to Brian Holmes in the mid-60s. Comparative education is a policy science. So I was distressed by the stance of that volume. I much preferred the World Yearbook of 2018, which is edited by, among other people, Terry Seddon, Seddon in Australia, and Noah Sobey. And this book is a brilliant book, rethinking basically historical sociology and its power. So it was a very theoretical and brilliant yearbook. Similarly, World Yearbooks edited by people like Tom Popkowitz are well worth pursuing. And of course, my third instance of adoration of the World Yearbook was the 2022 volume. And the World Yearbooks at the moment have been very good in terms of rethinking, and the other people to track down are the bright young scholars. For example, you mentioned Iveta Silova. Okay, have a look for Jeremy Rapalai, Rappleye, Jeremy Rapalai, who's based in Japan. Have a look for the work of Maria Manzon, who was until recently in Hong Kong and in Singapore, and is now also in Japan. And have a look at the writings of Takayama, okay, you know the name, Keita Takayama, who is brilliantly rewriting the field, accusing, and I was very amused, in Atlanta at the meeting of American Comparative Society, he stood up and accused the Americans of imperialism. And that produced some hilarious responses from the Americans, who of course don't think they're imperialists. So it's these brilliant new scholars to follow, and how the hell you run your career, I don't know. But let me just finish on with one final little point. When I was a student, I'd done a Bachelor of Science in the social sciences at the London School of Economics and Political Science. So I was well trained in a range of sciences, social sciences. I then trained as a teacher in Trinity College, Dublin. And I was very happy to become a school teacher because I've come from a family of school teachers, and I thought this is what I want to do. I then discovered that by the age of 30, I would have been head of a school, and I couldn't stand the notion I'd be head of a school from 30 until I was 65. 35 years of being head of a school. So I changed, and I decided I'd become a university academic. And when I was choosing what I would study for in the more advanced courses, such as advanced diplomas or MAs or PhD, I had to make a choice. I could choose either sociology, because I was pretty well trained in that, and indeed I used to teach sociology in universities in the States and so on, or I could choose comparative education. And I took a risk. There was a job almost every week in sociology in British universities at that time. And there was a job every 5 years in comparative education. And I bet myself, because I wanted to travel, I would do comparative education. So I was dead lucky. I mean, let's not be silly about this. I made it by the skin of my teeth. It could have gone wrong. And those are the risks you're going to take. And I have great sympathy, but I'm nothing to help you with about that. It's risk taking. Will you accept a temporary job, hoping that something will come up later? And crudely speaking, yes, do it, because you might get lucky, especially if you ask questions of the kind you just asked, Carlo. Thank you.
Yeah. If I add a comment, Bob, to what Carlo and the rest of the students, part of his question, or part of his of their response to your lecture, it reminded me. Was it Basil Bernstein? Like ages ago, he said that comparative education has a low theoretical problematic.
Yeah, hilarious. I mean, he came along to a doctoral seminar inside the institute, a doctoral seminar in comparative education, and it had one of the world's most distinguished comparativists in charge of that seminar at that time, Brian Holmes. And Brian Holmes tried to take over the seminar by which Basil was supposed to talk, by insisting that Brian Holmes, would rehearse his methodology. And Basil's response was, comparative education has a low-level problematique. And that was because Brian Holmes was saying, comparative education is about the improvement of educational policy. Comparative education is about the improvement of educational systems. Comparative education is about advising governments and the Minister of Education. And Basil, who is wonderfully unkind and vicious of tongue, and one of the very few academics in the world whom I totally admired, was cruel and simply told Professor Holmes that comparative education had a low-level problematique. Okay, how do you correct that? Well, one of the ways in which you correct that is you get a proportion of your students to worry less about methods of field research and to worry more about the intellectual questions which are being asked in cutting-edge studies of education, e.g. in anthropology or sociology, and they then rethink comparative education itself. And that is what I'm saying, that Lefteris is trying to rethink comparative education itself. Iveta, when she's not busy writing about post-socialism, is busy trying to rethink comparative education itself. Jeremy is doing that, and so on. There are a core of maybe 10 young scholars, and that's all you ever need. The field is rethought by 6 people, by 5 people, by 10 people. The fields are rethought by a very small minority of people. And so I'm not pessimistic. I think the next generation contains some superb young academics, and I will die happily. I don't wish to die soon and happily. I'd be very happy if much, much later I can die smiling because my field is in safe hands. I got applause because I'm going to die, I see. This seminar is full of torture and death. I mean, where are we? We must be in Spain with all those gloomy paintings by Goya in the National Museum. I mean, come on. Can we not giggle a bit? That's better. I can see people smiling now. Oh, dear me.
Thank you, Carlos, and the other guys.
Yeah, there's other students also probably that have some questions or comments in the group. So who goes next?
Yeah, let's. Who wants to be brave enough?
Before we take the floor again here, I just want to ask if someone online, because I know we don't want to take all the time here. So just checking on Asif, Andrew. Asif, you can speak.
Asif, you can go ahead.
Okay, thanks so much. Like this is one of the most beautiful lectures I have attended this year. And this
one of the most what?
Most beautiful lectures that I have attended this year. Can you?
I love you. How do you fall in love in Zoom? What a marvelous person you are. Fantastic. Yeah. Obviously highly intelligent as well. Yeah, good.
Thanks so much. And like I would like to relate the readings that we have done along with the lecture, and also am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. And also some of my personal experiences. I don't know if I'm posing a question or not, but this would be my reflections on it. So I first officially came across the term comparative education last year around January, and like I'll admit that I mistook it with a type of an experimental research method, like comparing two things. Maybe there are interventions or things like that. But later, when we were diving into the courseworks, and my Glasgow mates know it very well, that like of course we are comparing between two components or two entities or more than that. But what I felt in the end, that there are always equalizing criteria which might raise questions about those contexts and things. And while I was writing the assignment for my comparative education course, I was frequently asking myself, like, who am I talking for? Who am I trying to advocate for? And I felt that comparative education is not trying to give a singular or particular shape or definition to a certain aspect of whatever we are discussing. And like sometimes I was feeling like am I advocating the neoliberal policies, or am I trying to advocate the anti-governmental group of thinkers, or am I also trying to feed some ongoing oppression unknowingly? But I think these are the confusions that we go through when we discuss and we write in this competitive discussions. But like after the readings that we are given for winter school, I felt that bringing in the complexity, problematizing what we are discussing, the context or the issues, is one of the key aspects and key takeaways from this modality of learning. And oversimplification of ideas are the most problematic aspects that we can bring in competitive education. So like I think there shouldn't be any binary or very specific comments about our problems. We always should throw open questions and spaces, rooms for further discussion, further problematizing, bringing in the diversity and things like that. Yeah, that would be my comment. Thanks so much.
When I first went into comparative education, I was a school teacher, and I was teaching in the East End of London in a violent and, in a sense, a dangerous school where the children used to cut each other up with broken milk bottles and so on. It was violent. It was a blackboard jungle. And after a while there, 3 years, I decided I didn't really know what I was doing. I was a perfectly competent secondary school teacher. I could control my classes. I could go through routines of teaching, but I didn't know what I was doing. Was I moving the kids out of this area, or was I confirming them in their jobs as milkman, butcher, etc.? And so I decided to study sociology and comparative education in the evenings up in the University of London. to understand what I was doing. And I first moved into comparative thinking, the Americans have got this sort of problem in their schools. They can provide me with a solution in my work in this dangerous and difficult school. So moving into comparative education because you want to solve a problem, because you want to see what other countries are doing for the solution, is perfectly normal. And notice that a great deal of normal work in comparative is comparing, let's say, teacher education systems, or comparing, let's say, styles of teaching, I mean, child-centered teaching, etc., in an effort to try to improve someone else's education system, teacher education system, or, for example, your own. So this theme of reform, this theme of improvement, this theme of finding solutions is absolutely normal. What I would add to it, though, is you have to decide what is your position within comparative. Will you basically become an advocate for child-centered learning, which you will then distribute as a consultant around the world to places that don't have it, whether that's Barbados or Bermuda or what used to be called Burma. So in a sense, as a consultant, you're selling the solution, or as an academic comparativist, you're looking for the best teacher education system in the world, or the most child-centered. For me, no. For me, I have my commitment, which is I'm thinking that my form of comparative thinking, my form of comparisons, is about revealing flows of power. So I am analyzing and I'm showing how power flows around the world and how international influences, economic, political, and so on, big things such as empire, intersect with local, domestic forces. And then you get a certain educated identity emerging there, whether in Roman Britain or whether, for example, in Portuguese Brazil, or whether, for example, in a country that embraces PISA, as if PISA was non-problematic. So I'm perfectly comfortable with my own version of comparative, which is showing flows of power, and I'm showing how educated identity in, let us say, Afghanistan is currently going through a massive shift between the various forms of modernization that were being attempted under the American occupation and the tradition of the Taliban, which is, of course, what's loosely called a domestic force. It's also notice of community, which has changed the definition of educated identity massively, and is changing it right now. So similarly, in the American occupation of the Philippines, you get a very powerful link between the Americans and local elites, including the Catholic Church, to redefine during the American occupation the sense of what is a good education in the Philippines. So for me, it's flows of power, educated identities, and I can reveal them. Now, whether I then go on the streets and raise a banner and try to force everyone to reform, that's another step. I am not in that sense an activist, although I am still proud that when Mrs. Thatcher, I've said it 3 times. Damage. When Mrs. Thatcher made a separation between the fees for English students in universities and the fees for overseas students, I was on the streets. I was outraged. And of course, now the gap between foreign student fees and domestic fees is appalling. It's disgusting. And so, I'm prepared to be mildly activist, provided I don't get hit by police truncheons. But I don't see that as my main academic job, to be aggressively activist on the streets. I see it as my main academic job to do my best using theoretical ideas to offer critiques of educational patterns, educational systems, and I see my role as revealing power. And that's my job as an academic. And that is brilliantly what Bernstein did. If you think of Bernstein's own work in sociology, with his restricted and extended codes, with his work on a ritualization in schools, he brilliantly revealed the internal sociology of schools, showing flows of power. I find it a comfortable position to be occupied by myself. You go make your own choices. Several people have chosen to do the posts. For example, post-socialism, post-colonialism, post-modernity, post-foundationalism, and so on. There's a complete set of studies, all of which begin with the word post, including the word postman. You can't use the word postman. That's gendered. You can't use the word postman. It's got to be post person. What's the matter with you guys? Aren't you? Sorry, wife. What's the matter? You understand? You can't use the word man. Oh dear. All right. This is another question before I go and have wine with my breakfast.
Lefteris, I suggest that we collect 2 or 3 interventions and then we close because it's okay.
Guys, yeah, okay. So we open up the floor for 2-3 questions.
Yeah, but all together and then a final
Bob response.
By Robert.
Okay.
Okay. I see Tony wants to speak.
Yeah, Tony wants to speak. And who else? Yes, there is a hand there. I do not see the name. Apologize. And also I see another hand. Okay. So we start with we go to Nimra. Okay. And then to apologize. And Euphemia. Okay, Tony.
Okay, so can I start? Yeah, well, thank you, Bob. It has been a big privilege to have you giving the first lecture of this winter school. And yeah, just as an anecdote, I don't know if you read that chapter in the World Yearbook 2012 by Geoff Whitty, because he also made a strong critique to the concept of policy traveling. And he suggests that we talk about policy tourism in a sort of sarcastic way, in the way reference societies are portrayed today. But my question is about the review that you did to the misunderstandings with comparative education today, and the importance to rewrite the field of comparative education. And I was wondering, what do you think about the label of global studies in education? Do you think that global studies in education is something that can help to modernize the field of comparative education, that includes, of course, comparative education, but also global policy studies in education? So I was wondering, what do you think about this field of studies in dialogue with comparative education, but also as a tool to make comparative education to dialogue better with other, let's say, sectoral approaches to global studies in health, global studies in social policy, etc., etc. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Tony.
No, let's first, Robert, take other questions first, and then you answer all together, if you don't mind. Lefteris, you are mute now. You are mute.
I'm so sorry. Thank you, Tony, for the question. So we take another 2 more questions, and then you reply to all of them. Yes, is that okay?
Yeah, and effortless. I can reply to 3 questions all at once. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, let's hope the questions fit together. I mean, what if the next question is about Afghanistan? Oh, go on. Perfectly right.
Let's get to the second question. Yes.
You can just talk.
Am I audible? Can you hear me? Yes. No, of course you guys can. Can people online hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Now I just tried I'll try my best to be short. I don't drink alcohol, so I don't have a wine solution right now. But I would say that this lecture did keep us extremely involved, and of course, we're going to revisit a lot of our thoughts with regards to this field. I personally feel I don't think it's more of a question than a reflection, but it's just this idea that the field of comparative education is discussing at vast lengths the differentiation between the international and the local. And I think contemporary field does talk, it has reached some consensus so as to talk about or to alleviate the importance of the local. So thankfully, we all have somewhat agreed that there needs to be an importance of the local context. But I think that the very complicated and muddled economies that we're living in right now, even defining the local is a very difficult task, because inwardly there are a lot of layered power structures that are local as well as international. So of course you have a lot of advocates and certain groups that are advocating for certain local identities, but you have local power structures that are imitating international ideologies. So of course it's easy to fight structures, but it's not easy to fight ideologies, which makes it all the more a difficult job. So I think my question is, and of course more than an understanding, is that while there shouldn't be much debate intellectually and morally around certain problems, I think the question is rather a methodological one. So for example, as we've all agreed that yes, girls should not be marginalized and there should be education for all genders, regardless of any discrimination. The problem is we're still not approaching things the right way. So for example, while we do want girls in, say, Afghanistan or Pakistan or the fashionably poor countries to be educated, we still have designed programs to sort of bring white savior development projects so as to solve these very problems. So I think my question then is that while we've dealt with these moral dilemmas, how does the field of comparative education present a methodological solution to address these locally, if not internationally?
Okay, thank you. And we move to the last question of Thimia.
Congratulations for your interesting presentation. I want also to ask, we often note, we ask Curtin, that the researcher sees what he's predisposed to see. What would you suggest to someone who is going to study foreign educational systems?
What would I suggest for someone who's going to study what?
To study foreign educational systems.
Ah.
The question of Sattler, I mean, what do you, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Wine.
Thank you.
Wine. Begin from wine if possible. I do not accept consultancies in Saudi Arabia and so on. But let me try and, shall I try and respond at this point, Lefteris?
Yes, please go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, comparative education has been appallingly parochial. In other words, it's locked itself into little boxes around major scholars such as Brian Holmes, Edmund King, and so on. It has rejected other forms of other modalities of studying education. So there was terrific tension between, for example, the sociology department, the sociology of Basil Bernstein and the thinking of Brian Holmes. And indeed, I think Holmes and King were frightened of sociology. And so this effort to make comparative education into a discipline, in the sense, Tony, in which Richard Peters used to use the word discipline, i.e. something has its own vocabulary, etc., like philosophy of education. Richard, yes. So comparative education got itself into a complete mess, trying to become a discipline with its own words, its own vocabulary, its own methods. And indeed, at a certain point, it began to worship method. And so one of the current characteristics is that comparative education is being liberated because, for example, probably one of the most important political and sociological events in the last decade and a half has been the shift in governance of education systems. So the work of people like Martin Lawn, or as I mentioned earlier, Bob Lingard, and so on. This work has been crucial. I mean, Greg and so on. The list is very long, as you in particular know. This work has been crucial in trying to shake up what was becoming a kind of monkish, sorry, that's a sexist word, which is becoming a kind of closed sect, a religious sect of persons, 6 people talking to each other. So the more interventions, the more breakthroughs we can get from, illustratively, not merely new themes on governance, but the more Italian comparativists can intervene and begin to correct some of the extreme social science forms of comparative education popular in the United States, the more the people from Brazil and Argentina can say, look, wait a minute, a good chunk of the world has been left out of comparative education, with the exception of a few French and Spanish and a couple of Americans who've taken an interest in Latin America. So the deparochialization of comparative education is now crucial. And I would argue that the more economists, the more sociologists, etc., historians, the rescue of serious historical comparative studies is now important. I do not mean invoking history as an ideological banner, such as my friend Andreas Kazimierz tends to do, but I'm talking about serious historical work by people like Daniel Tröller. So I'm delighted when someone like Tom Popkowitz or Fazal Rizvi intervenes and writes, quote, a comparative paper. Tom refuses to be called a comparativist. He's perfectly comfortable with his own identity, but we need the field of comparative to be broken up by other specialists. The question about the third question about what you look for first in terms of overseas and foreign education, and I said wine, and it was in a sense a serious answer, because what you need to address immediately is the history and the economic structures and the sociological framings of education. You must taste the foreign. You can't do comparative education without worrying about language, race, geographic and economic circumstances, religions, political philosophies and political systems. The Hans factors are where you start as an orientation, You can't seriously say anything sensible about Brazil unless you start away from the Brazilian education system. You start with French influence in the 19th century, maybe. You might want to start earlier with Portuguese occupation of Brazil. You might want to stress the theme of republicanism. You might want to insist on the role of the Catholic Church. You might want to insist on race and slavery, but you do not, if you're trying to get access to a foreign system, a foreign pattern of education, you do not start with education. You start well away and you come in from outside. Individual scholars in particular instances might brilliantly show, as Elaine Unterhalter will show when she lectures to you, they will brilliantly illustrate certain themes. But notice that when Elaine is illustrating those themes, gender or race or something, she has begun well away from the education system. So the first step in comparative education is not to collect educational descriptions. Collect that later. The middle question left to us, I have lost. I was so delighted that we're getting another question from that table that I lost it.
I think, but Namra can confirm, the question was about how comparative education can methodologically help us to understand the local context.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yes, well, the short answer is it can't, because nobody can agree on the list of what counts as local context. I repeat, Hans emphasized geographic and economic circumstances, language, think of Belgium, for example, race, think of South Africa, for example, in contrast, say, to Brazil or contemporary and earlier United States. So political philosophy, religion, think of countries split badly by religion, including Ireland. So there are, in a sense, huge strategic views of what counts as local context. The core problem, the word context is completely meaningless. Michael Crossley, a professor in Bristol and a friend of ours on the board of the journal, has spent most of his life trying to define the word context. It's not definable. It is a four-letter word that should never, ever be used because you cannot define it. Context, notice in, say, Chile or in Saudi Arabia, includes the context of the education system, includes rainfall. And the context in some countries includes the tyranny of distance, e.g. Australia and Canada. The context as a word is indescribable, it's undefinable. So to say, what do I need to take into account in terms of local context? I would repeat, in the learning phase, why not read a lot and work and try to understand, e.g. for Belgium, factors of race, language, religion, and so on. Why not try that as your mapping of local context? But you can't do any better than that because no one can find the wretched word. No one can define the wretched word context. It really is a four-letter word and it should be banned from all civilized societies and churches. Finished after this, I've finished.
Well,
Have some kind of
so we finish with a ban. Not allowed to use the word context or background information.
No, you can't. I mean, my own view is you can't have background information. You can't have context. You can't have. And actually, I'm very nervous when I hear the word macro, micro. I mean, why not use big and little, but also tell me what big means and tell me what little means. So if you say macro, micro, I say, what about meso? So, I mean, to analyze the word in the world in terms of two categories, big, little, and so on, it is a wee bit dangerous. The world is a bit more complicated than that, unless you're thinking about the Taliban.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. Javier, we are finished. I mean, we're 5 minutes past. I guess this is the end of this morning session. I would like to thank Bob for his stimulating, deconstructive, and simultaneously constructive lecture. Javier, we come back here at 4 o'clock. I mean, how is the plan?
I think it starts at 3 again. Am I wrong, Lion?
Yes. No, 3 o'clock. Yeah, 4 o'clock Cyprus time. Yes.
Yeah, that's for you. It's 3 o'clock local time here in Barcelona. So in 1 hour time, students will meet for the academic writing workshop. Thank you so much, Bob, for your excellent lecture. It's been a privilege.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed enormously. It's very lovely here in Brazil.
You deserve your breakfast, definitely.
but not with wine.
With wine.
I always have wine with my breakfast lectures.
That's great.
I'm going to breakfast now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for attending and see you later.
See you later, guys.
Ah, okay.